Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today in my series on narratology, I will briefly go over a couple of concepts and things that I have discussed in the previous videos, but there were some questions from some of you and you wanted me to clarify a little more. So I will first explain where I had said in one of the videos that the formalists believed that the words in a poem are not necessarily just signifiers but also signified. So I'll explain once again what that means, and then I'll go over the three terms that we had talked about, and those are the text, the story, and fabula. What are their distinctions and why is it important to know in narratology? So first of all, the first thing about words in a poem not necessarily just being signifiers but also signified. Now, the reason they become signified, now what is a signified? A signified is what a signifier signifies, right? If we look at the words in a poem, traditionally we think of them as signifiers, right? That they mean something, they point to something, and that's how we construe meanings. But that is if you stay inside the poem. But if there is something outside the poem determining how the words in a poem need to be read, then while being signifiers, those words also become signified because a structure outside the poem, the form of the poem itself, right? Or something else outside that has a bearing upon the poem can give dual meanings to the signifiers in it, thus making them into signified. So how can that happen? So let's say that you're reading a sonnet. If you're reading a sonnet, the words in a sonnet, of course, have their own internal significance. But one of the reasons you read the words in a sonnet differently is because the form and expectations associated with it they have a bearing on the words in the poem, right? So let's say the Dark Lady sonnet from Shakespeare, right? Why do we find that it's either playful or ironic? Because we associate that sonnet is usually a love poem about the beloved. But if there are all these dark references to the Dark Lady, those references then become dark or ironic to us not because of the words in the poem itself, but because we are reading them as signified by the sonnet form, which creates a certain, horizon of expectations maybe. So that's kind of an explanation of how words in a poem, according to the formalists, and then when they get into narrative analysis, are not necessarily just signifiers but also signified. Now you can also understand it even better if you were to use Barth's explanation of the mythical sign, which is slightly in a different context, but the system is the same. So in Barth, what Barth says is that sometimes a sign becomes mythical because there is a dual layer of signification. So how? Book, B-O-O-K, book, the concept of the book that forms in your mind, see, is one signifier and signified relationship, right? But if we combine the two and make a signifier, then the book can be something else. It can be law, it can be the Bible, it can be the Quran, right? Now that is the sign becoming mythical, right? And it happens because signifier and signified that constituted one element now further signifies something else. So that's the mythical reading of the sign. So that was the first part. Now going on to the second part, the three terms that I talked about, the story, the text, and the fabula, right? Now if you look at the graphic in front of you on the screen, you can see that on the top is the author, and then on another end is the reader, right? And in between the author and the reader is the narrative text, right? And the narrative text can be a written text, it can be an oral text, it can be a filmic text, but it's a text that you, me, or everyone else receive, right? Or read or purchase. It's a material thing, right? Within that narrative text is the story, right? Which contains the narrative. But the story is how different elements are arranged, right? All the things that you do, temporality, spatiality, setting, characters, sequence of events, flashbacks, foreshadowing, all of this is part of the story, and it is highly contrived and arranged, right? And then at the heart of the story is fabula. And fabula are unjumbled, unworked stories, right? You could just think of it, okay, if you are thinking of writing a memoir, right? The fabula of that memoir is your life, right? Whatever has happened to you, whatever you have thought, whosoever you have interacted with. Maybe there is a chronology to it because you've lived that life, right? But it's in raw form. It hasn't been given any shape. You haven't added any stylistic elements to it, any formalistic elements to it. The moment you decide to write a memoir, so first of all, your actions in deciding to tell that story are already partially determined by the genre called the memoir. So chances are you'll follow that. Then within reconstruction of that fabula, you might start from the end, you might start in the middle, right? You might juxtapose one thing against the other, you might make a composite of different memories and put them at one place. All of those decisions, arranging different events according to their significance and not chronology, maybe, would then convert that fabula, that raw material that you had from your own life, into a story. That arrangement, right? The Russian formalists would say that's defamiliarization. By arranging a text a certain way, what the author does is it defamiliarizes the real pattern. So this aspect of rearranging the fabula, other than being called defamiliarization, it was also called making strange. And the purpose was that by doing that, what a narrative can do is it can jar the reader from their everyday realities and maybe force them to think about it, right? So that's a different theory, different debate. So overall, then, a text, right, is the material text in front of you that you read, that you purchase, that you write about, that you watch. The story is how whatever is told in a text, how is it arranged formalistically, sequence of events, causality, connection from one event to another, the characters, the plot, all of those are elements of the story. And then story is comprised of fabula, and fabula are the experiences and knowledge, whatever you are choosing to tell your story, but that's in a raw form, it's in an unarranged form. So I had used the example of Robinson Crusoe, right? Daniel Defoe's novel. So in that, the novel itself in its printed form is the text that is in front of you. Then the story is how the things are arranged within the narrative. Friday and Robinson Crusoe being stranded on an island, the entire project of Homo economicus, all of that is the story. The fabula, ideally speaking, would be, okay, here is a guy who was stranded on an island, this is what happened to him. Now, of course, Robinson Crusoe is a fictional character, so we have to assign the fabula then to Daniel Defoe. So while constructing the story, whatever elements of a stranded person's story he must have plotted, thought about all of that aspect of a story of survival, right? That is the fabula of it. Now, keep in mind that this is coming to us from structuralists and from Russian structuralists and formalists too. Like especially Vladimir Prop has a huge influence on this theory. And what did Prop do? He went and collected folk tales. I think about 3,000 of them, and studied them to craft certain basic structures that every story follows. So and why did they go to the folk tales is because as structuralists they were trying to find the originary stories, the original stories from where all stories come, because they would then contain the pure structure, right? And then they could take those pure structures and extrapolate from them and suggest, here are the 36 narrative structures that exist in the world. Every story is told in this structure. So, of course, the fabula are also then those raw stories that those people collected. Now, just on a side note, if you really want to read structurally speaking, so like there is one structure out of the many that Prop and others figured out, is the Cinderella story. So if you just focus on the words in a story, it's a unique story. But if you look at the structure of it, you find out it's the story of a person who is born poor or is very low in the hierarchy of class, and then this person gets a chance at life. There is always some kind of magical or outward intervention, and then finally they succeed. Now, if you keep that in mind, every rags to riches story is a Cinderella story. And then you can find Cinderella stories in contemporary world, in the movies, as well as, in the rest of the world, in folk tales as well as in written narratives. So any upward mobility story, for example, even the movies, right? Pretty Woman, right? The text of the movie is the text. The way things are organized in the movie are the story. The fabula is the original Cinderella story, right? That is kind of the distinction. I hope this makes these things clear. I will continue this series, and in the next video we'll move on from our earlier discussion and discuss, how these things are now studied by some of the leading narratologists or narrative theory practitioners. That's all today. Thank you so much. Take care. And as always, peace and love.